Hello and welcome. I'm Patrick Curtis, your host and chief monkey, and this is the Wall Street Oasis podcast. Join me as I talk to some of the community's most successful and inspirational members to gain valuable insight into different career paths and life in general. Let's get to it. In this episode, Weiss shares his path working at Morgan Stanley, Goldman Sachs, and JP Morgan for over 20 years. His path on Wall Street includes stints in Prime Brokerage and talent management. His unique perspective into Wall Street culture shows his passion to help facilitate change and help solve attrition issues at the junior level. Learn what advice he has for students looking to break into the industry and what he thinks is the key element for success. Enjoy. So Weiss, welcome to the Wall Street Oasis podcast.
Thank you, Patrick. It's an honor to be here, a privilege to enter the world of monkeys and bananas.
It'd be great if you could just give the listeners a short summary of your bio.
Sure, Patrick. Well, I've been in the last 22, 23 years, Barclays Capital, JP Morgan, Morgan Stanley, Goldman Sachs, 14 of those years at JP Morgan. And I just recently left the industry to kind of start my own initiative. All those lessons learned, and there's so much of it with regards to leadership. I worked in HR a little bit. I worked obviously in the business the majority of the time. But I think I have a good understanding of sort of the infrastructure of these institutions, kind of how they work. And I want to add value and bring value to our next generation, who I think are so talented and potentially a little misunderstood. And I'm trying to sort of bridge those gaps also generationally with sort of a more strategic initiative that I'm working on. But in the end, I just want to bring value to our next generation. You guys have a great audience. So
well, that's where they're listening. They're listening right now. Yeah. So that's great. Thank you for taking the time. So I guess, going back, from undergrad, you kind of came out and you were doing more like consulting type work. I know you ended up in Prime Brokerage at JP, but can you talk a little bit about like just the different roles you had throughout the firm?
Sure. It was interesting. My indoctrination into Wall Street really was my first big role was at Barclays Capital. Mm-hmm. I got into the world of collateral management at the time where my first client, actually my biggest client, and maybe they teach this now in school, was long-term capital. So my job was to monitor their exposure in equity derivatives, right? So I was actually calculating mark to market and seeing where there was collateral needed, and if there's a shortfall, we call for more margin. So here I am just out of school, and they're like, I didn't know any better. These hedge funds, you're assigned various hedge. I think I had Renaissance Capital, I had Long-Term Capital, I had a couple others. Yep. And I had to just at that time, because of the technology, we had to kind of manually do mark-to-market calculations. And they would send me their blotter. I would look at ours. I'd reconcile the two to make sure there's no. It's crazy how we've developed. But anyway, long story short, as some of you guys might know, Long-Term Capital sort of collapsed. They made some risky bets in Asia and Russia. And they were highly leveraged. Obviously, our bank was vested very much so. We were part of a consortium to help bail them out. But what I was doing is every day I had to go to, this is me at a 23-year-old, going to Bob Diamond's office. He was the CEO of Barclays Capital in New York at the time. Every day I had to go to their CEO's office and give him a summary of where our exposure was and how much they were short collateral, right? So it was like, I didn't know any better, but I was doing the job and I was putting the data together and I was going to his office. I didn't realize sort of the global ramifications and but at a young age, it taught me sort of how to comport myself, under trying times, under duress, because at times it was like, you need to have this data within 20 minutes, Mr. Diamond needs to see you, right? Mm-hmm. So again, it just, school didn't prepare me for that. Didn't prepare me for that. So I had to kind of learn to be disciplined, to be, when you communicate to the seniors, it doesn't matter how old you are. If you're exposed to an MD at a junior age, like, you got to have that self-respect to say that, hey, I can hold my own with these people.
Yeah.
Right? And I proved it to myself.
What was there's a famous book about long-term capital management. It was, what was it called? Do you remember? It was.
No, there's a lot of.
We'll put it in the show notes, but it's something it basically chronicles the whole collapse and the lead up to the collapse in terms of, I think they had a lot of strategies that were like all betting on like mean reversion type stuff on interest rates. And then basically just levered it out. So like the returns were amazing for a long time.
Well, the interesting thing is that they hired all these incredible mathematicians. I think it was the Black Scholes model.
Yeah,
Actually, was it Scholes was actually on their board.
yeah,
So it had sort of enticed these big investment banks to, hey, we want a piece of that, right?
right.
And
Very interesting.
but anyway,
That's
it
amazing.
was
Right out of school, you were on that.
right out of school. I got a dose of that, and so I was involved in those discussions and the sort of the presentations and all those things. And after that,
Well,
that
actually,
experience.
before we go there,
Yeah,
you're an undergrad. Are you knowing finance is your thing? Are you thinking,
that's a great question. I studied finance at Boston University. I took the sort of the investment banking, this, that. You hear all these things, and what should I get into? I just wanted a job at the time.
yeah,
So I interviewed in whatever job I got in the industry. I didn't know any better at the time. Now there's so much more information at your disposal. Obviously, Wall Street, Oasis, and there's so many great platforms. And so coming into the industry, I kind of got one of those operations type jobs, and it led to it was at that time mortgage-backed securities was hot, right? So we were getting into I was into that, and then ultimately into Barclays, getting in that collateral management space, which then morphed into a prime brokerage space, which is more of sort of what the crux of what I've done most of my career, and whether it's equities, fixed income, or foreign exchange. So
you let people
um,
know who aren't as familiar with prime brokerage. It's just
yeah,
services.
prime brokerage is just facilitating securities lending in the markets. There are a lot of um, complex products where these investment banks are selected as prime brokers. Morgan Stanley, Goldman Sachs, and J.P. Morgan are the biggest ones per se, and luckily I've been at all three of them. And they sort of facilitate those transactions in the markets, act as a custodial service, leverage transactions, securities lending. So there's a lot there, and you can get involved in many different capacities. I was mostly in client services, so that
Yeah.
was sort of a front office job, facilitating the relationship with the hedge funds, and sort of appeasing their requests and making sure that they had all they needed to in terms of reporting, and um, just giving them day-to-day sort of reports on kind of how things were going, but also addressing any of their issues that inevitably arose on a day-to-day basis. So and then that sort of morphed into leadership positions and taking on teams, and I got really interested in that, and helping working with, especially I loved working with our young talent always. But that's sort of a short summary of kind of how we got into the industry, and then ultimately how it sort of progressed.
It's great. And so, like, you were like coming right out of school, it was more like just get a job, and you had studied finance. It was a little more operationally focused. Then eventually um, it was the collateral management, like MBS type work, and then collateral
Equity
management.
derivatives, equity
Okay.
derivatives, and that's where the collateral management sort of stemmed. And I did get involved in collateral management at Morgan Stanley.
Hmm.
And then you sort of find your way, and finding your purpose and your why in this industry is not easy.
Yeah.
Obviously, as if you want to get into investment banking, which I know a lot of our audience is keen on doing, so it's trying to get into it for the right reasons, and understanding your purpose as to your intentions. Are you in it to make money? Are you in it to find wealth and that glamour that's so our industry is so noted for? But also understanding sort of what the realities on the ground are, right, and preparing yourself for that. And I think with myself, I didn't know what to expect.
Yeah.
I didn't like I said, I didn't have all the social media and all these things to make myself aware of what was to come. And I had to learn for myself and just sort of be in it and kind of figure out which area do I want to go into.
You're
And I
telling
think
me
the
there was
key,
no fin memes back in 95
no, no,
or whatever?
believe it or not, no. But God knows I could have used some back then to help guide me. Um, but in the end, I found myself and found my calling, and leadership and those kinds of things, where I knew I could help groom sort of our next generation, and take care of those around me is so important to me. And it took some time to figure all that out, but ultimately we did.
Yeah, and talk to me about your time at JP because you were there for a good 14 years. Talk to me about just the internal promotions and the decisions. Like, how would you go about, talking about raises? How would you go about talking about like a lateral transition or even knowing where you wanted to go? Like, how
Yeah.
did you map out that career? Did you get a mentor or what happened?
Yeah, no, phenomenal question. So obviously you talk about this a lot. Networking is so incredibly important, and the way that you network is key. And I think so many just are shy to do so. And if they're working in a particular area, it's good to sort of venture onto different areas and attend. There's so many forums that are available to you. and there's so many discussions like outside of hours. And what I would do is I would simply network in terms of initially it's your peers, right? So if you're supporting a particular group, who are your stakeholders,
Mm-hmm.
right? And you have impact with those stakeholders. So let's get to know who those stakeholders are. What do they do? What are their functions? Learn them. And then who are the players? Who are sort of the decision makers? And get an audience with them and reach out to them. And you'll be surprised to know that, look, just because they're an MD or an ED, it's not that they don't want to talk to you. They're actually 9 times out of 10, they'll be thrilled to pass on the information and the knowledge that they have to speak to you. Now, you don't want to go above your management. So you want to be fully transparent to let them know that, hey, if you speak to your manager, that I'd love to do some networking just to learn a little bit more about these other areas. And I think skip level meetings are also important, right? So if you're speaking to your manager, having that discussion to their manager and sort of gaining that exposure. And so I think networking. So number one, it's networking, and how you do that is really, really important. There's an art to it, and I think you guys teach that really well. And then the second thing is just in terms of having those discussions on getting to that next level or getting that next job. A lot of it's just your own research through this networking, just gathering information, and then being transparent with those around you. Like if your manager, if you're not happy at your job, for example, be honest and just say, hey, there's some things I'm going through, kind of feel like I need a change or this or that. And but transparency is key. So just to be honest with, you don't want to sort of do things behind someone's back. People do it all the time. Sometimes it's a necessity, but I think there's a way to do it also. And to way
Yeah,
to
I can tell
comport
you,
yourself.
I felt like it was a necessity. When I was transitioning out of investment banking to private equity, I didn't feel really supported.
Yeah.
I felt like I had to go to these interviews at 6 a.m. out in Connecticut, taking trains at 4 a.m., 5 a.m. to get there, coming back. And so and it was known. And sure enough, when I said I was leaving, it was hey, no, you should stay. And it was a lot of hey.
Yeah. So I think externally, of course, externally, you got to do what you got to do. Internally, it's a little more challenging and a little more, it's sensitive, right? So absolutely, externally, you got to do what you got to do. You're not going to tell your manager that you're interviewing externally.
Yeah.
Although with my teams, I always said, hey, let me know if you're interviewing externally. I'd love to help you get there. There are those managers, believe it or not, that will do that.
Yeah.
Very rare though. But internally, there's an art to how to navigate and then those discussions about comp and there's just so much out there, tools in terms of arming yourselves with, trying to gain those tools and that confidence to be able to have those discussions because they're not easy. And it could be make or break. It could be that your manager hears this from you and is like, you know what, I don't want this problem anymore. And then they'll start working to get you out to manage you out ultimately.
Yeah.
Right. So the way that you actually bring up those discussions can be taught.
How did you manage that? Because you had a long run and you made several transitions. How did you?
I did.
How did you approach that?
With me, it was just, it was honesty. And for me, I'd like to learn about different areas. And, if you're sort of pigeonholed in one particular area, I think that could work against you.
You also weren't jumping after 6 months. You're trying to, it looks like you were jumping after an average of 2.5, 2 years. So
yeah, that's about right. That's about right. I mean, you gotta absorb the work that you're doing and learn it. And then, every area has a shelf life. Especially if you're in those sort of roles where, look, if you're going down the investment banking path, these days it's clear that most people want to go into PE or VCs or hedge funds. Ultimately, after a couple of years, use that as a launching pad. But I think even in those, when people want to take those paths, I think they can actually look at things a lot differently internally if they're a prestigious investment bank. There's just a world of opportunities there, and sometimes we chase the money or what we think is more glamorous, when in fact, in the long run, it may be to your detriment and your mental health and all those things. And there's an art to making those decisions and understanding sort of the macro rather than the here and now and what are our peers doing and and trying to be competitive in that regard. And at those times, I didn't have those pressures. I was doing what was right for me. I think it's temperament, and knowing your own temperament is so important when you make these choices, and knowing the culture of these various teams and whether or not you can withstand that culture, whether or not you can thrive in that culture.
Yeah.
You know, whether or not you could flourish in that culture. If you're just going there without that information because it's rewarding from a compensation perspective or from a prestige perspective, but that once you're there, you don't have the temperament to succeed in that culture, then it's going to backfire on you and you'll be miserable and you'll have mental health issues and eventually you'll quit and it'll look bad on your resume.
You'll quit
Right.
or you get
So,
fired.
oh, you
One
quit
of
or
the
you
two.
get fired.
Yeah.
Exactly. You'll get exposed one way or the other.
Yeah.
So understanding like that's all has to do with self-awareness and really examining oneself and
Yeah.
being objective.
I totally agree. I mean, I had a live stream, and like I had so many of the questions were like, can I get to investment banking from this? Can I get to investment banking from that? And like, I'm just like,
Yeah.
do you really want this? To, you know, like you realize you're going to be sleeping at the office. So a lot of people look at the comp and they look at the hours and they say, oh yeah, that's 80-hour week average, but they don't realize like that scales up to over 100 hours a week some weeks. Like you're not going to be sleeping, and it's actually painful.
It is. It
And
is.
so yeah, it's
I
hard to
just
live
don't
it.
think it's hard to live it. And then once they're living it, then it's like that's when the regret sets in. And but you know, anytime you want to make a move, or even now, if you're thinking, what should I do? Do I want to go into, you know, PE, or do I want to work at a hedge fund, or like take the time to research it. There's so much information on YouTube now. You know, obviously Patrick and Wall Street Oasis is a wealth of information, but do the due diligence, but also understand yourself and your capabilities and don't stretch yourself. To a degree you can, but know your limits, right? As a person, as a human being, and know what your capacities are. And because listen, those areas are not for the faint of heart, right? And
Has the pendulum swung too far away from banking to buy side? So like that's the other thing you said, like, oh yeah, because everyone's like private equity, private equity, private equity. It's like,
Well, I'll tell you a funny story. I was invited to speak at the University of Pennsylvania Wharton Undergrad Finance Club. Wonderful students, wonderful. I'm sure, hopefully, some of the listeners. I know they're very well aware of what you do.
Mm-hmm.
Great kids, super bright, obviously. And look, some of them were already plotting their exits from investment banking already, and they're sophomores, right? Just to say that, look, we've heard this about investment bank. Is that true? And how do I get to PE? And I know that, you know, it's so more rewarding and less hours and more money. And, you know, and my friend, you know, who's a senior, just graduated and is working at this, you know, I won't mention names, and he's suffering and he's having headaches. He can't sleep at night, but he's getting paid. And, you know, but the fact that they were already plotting their exits was startling to me, right? And I think it's sort of a wake up to our industry leaders just to say, look, let's talk about culture and all these things and how do we improve things for our next generation. Otherwise, we're going to lose the best and the brightest to startups, to fintech, to, you know, I don't want to see that happen to our industry.
Yeah, it's interesting. You know, going back to the 90s, if you look at a chart of just average analyst attrition average analyst tenure rather across the banks, I think it was at like 2.5, 3 years back then. It's I think close to a year now.
Yeah, Poets and Quants, I'm sure you're aware of it. Great resource. I think you've actually provided them some data. They have a great article about just that and how attrition has significantly increased just in the past. I think COVID contributed to it, obviously, but I think culture and where we're at. Remember, Wall Street, you guys know it's an old institution that has not changed their ways, and we need, you know, and whereas the world has changed.
Yeah, and the efforts that have been made around it. I mean, if you think about like when someone is valuable, that second year of their analyst stint is when they're really valuable. That first year, the first 6 months at least, they're pretty useless. And so, at least for me, I was background. So like my point is like that's a huge loss losing
so much
in that second year. It's a massive loss. So I guess what's your thoughts on like just what has been rolled out in terms of pencil down? Like some banks are doing like pencils down on Friday. Some people are saying, you know, 1 weekend off per month.
I think at the end of the day, those things are nice to haves, you know, the work from homes things and all those things. But let's face it, an MD who's now reached that level and is now dealing with junior bankers and those who are going into their second year, let's say, they kind of have that inkling that eventually they're gonna leave, right? So why waste that energy on further educating them or spending more time with them? It's sort of like this cycle, this never-ending cycle that just sort of perpetuates itself, where if you only invested the time at an MD level with your first year analysts, imagine the impact it could have on them in their output, but also in their actual desire to stay and perhaps take on a bigger role or to do different things, regardless of what's out there in the markets for them. Right. And I think that's where we need to kind of shift that mindset, because that MD is loath to make that extra effort to try to connect with that first year analyst, but in fact they can, and think extra snacks and, free work from home to another extra day, or those things are nice to haves, right? But in the end, it comes down to the fundamentals of, do you feel valued as an employee?
Yeah, and I know that some of the banks that they've been doing a lot more analyst associate promotes, even like second years or getting like associate titles in some cases.
And they're throwing more money at them, but we
Or more
know that
money.
that's not. Yeah, but that's not. I mean, that was a big thing that Goldman did, and
Yeah,
it's not
been shown
sustainable.
not to. It's been shown also not to like really make that big of an impact. I think in many studies.
Exactly, exactly, and
Yeah.
yeah, and we're dealing with a lot of variables at play, and I think we need to understand what those variables are rather than the monetary gains or those things.
Yeah, it's super interesting. So okay, so you're at JP for a long time, VP in Prime Brokerage for a while, and then you made a change. Tell me about like that transition specifically, and what were it was to kind of go work in talent. So
Yeah, that's so I wanted to ultimately, I knew I wanted to launch my own initiative, and like I said earlier, leverage all my experience and kind of help that next generation, but also our current leaders.
Mhm.
I wanted to understand sort of the hiring process. I
Mhm.
was a hiring manager for so many years working with recruiters,
Yep.
and I got to be honest, and for any recruiters out there, no knock on you guys, but look, being in the business and working with recruiters, they don't know the business, right? They
Yep.
don't know the business. And when I took this role in recruiting, I was a lead in front office recruiting for a prominent organization. Um, one of my strategies was, hey, why don't we recruiters take part in the training programs that the analysts do, as far as the subject matters? And can you give us access to those training programs? Ultimately, we were not allowed access for legal reasons, but what I was trying to do was distill industry information and knowledge so that when they're speaking to potential candidates, they're not speaking at that generic level,
Mhm.
right? Where they have some ability to communicate with that language. And I think, for me, it was to go in and learn sort of the intricacies of recruiting, what it takes to get in, the mechanics of it, but also to help transform it. Because I like to transform teams and processes. And I thought, you know what? I know there's a gap in recruiting because I lived it. I can't tell you how many times I would take a recruiter to the side and it's like, let me spend half an hour with you and let me really go through the job with you and this is what I need from you. And I would actually give them a breakdown on prime brokerage or
Mhm.
custody and what that means. Um, and so you have sort of the intangibles that a recruiter should be good at, sort of ascertaining those intangibles from a candidate, as well as then the specifics and the technicals and all those. Um, but that's the area that we lacked, right? And so for me, it was important to learn sort of that space and take that knowledge. Now that I know it, now that I know well, kind of how recruiting works, what they look for, kind of the working with the hiring managers and sort of their mentalities. I can take all that knowledge plus all my business knowledge and everything I've done with leadership and kind of translate that into my new initiative, which is more around coaching and leadership consulting and individuals that need sort of a guide through how to navigate their way through corporate America.
So let's get to that soon. One last question though, in terms of the talent acquisition manager type role, did
Yeah.
you see in your time, I think it was at Morgan, did you see specifically, the shift? I guess it had already happened to HireVue, or your opinion on like these video interviews, trying to open it up I think the line from the banks is that it's opening up a wider breadth and ability to scan more potential candidates. I'd love to hear your thoughts on like those
From a
filters.
scale perspective,
Yep.
definitely, but I can tell you, um, logistically, there was a lot of challenges, and from an efficiency standpoint, I think we fell off a little bit in terms of just the coordination, the technical issues sometimes,
Mhm.
and you lose sort of that authentic, um, the person behind the camera, like that they lose their authentic self, and you could tell sometimes some weren't comfortable with it. And how do I know that I'm seeing the best version of yourself, right? So honestly,
Somebody super awkward, like looking away, like
yeah,
can't look at the
exactly,
camera
exactly.
and like.
Exactly. So I got to be honest, I'm not a fan of HireVue. It certainly is used on a larger scale now. And I know those that are listening in, you're obviously going to be partaking in any of that. And there's a certain skill to be able to prepare yourself for those types of interviews. And I know you guys have a lot of that content as well to help
Yep.
prepare you for it. But yeah, I'm not a big fan of it, but it's there.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's definitely it's after I went through all the recruiting that started kind of rolling out, and so wanted to get your thoughts on it in terms of yeah. So you were at Morgan Stanley, and then you started up your own thing. Tell us a little bit more about Zen Culture Solutions, and maybe tell people where they can find you, what it's all about, and yeah, I'd love to just.
Yeah, so thank you, Patrick. Yeah, Zen Culture Solutions with an X. I believe in the Zen mindset. I was a big Kobe Bryant fan for all those basketball fans out there, and he employed sort of the Zen principles taught to him by his coach Phil Jackson at the time.
Mhm.
But I truly believe in sort of being at peace with oneself in anything that you do, whether in your personal life or at work, and in leadership positions. Unless you have that calm within you, when you go through turmoil, when you go through these rough periods. I was there in 2008 at JP Morgan. I just got the job at JP Morgan when, crap hit the fan, and we had that financial crisis, and surviving that rough terrain during those times, it required a certain inner peace to be able to function, sort of with your mind in a space where you feel like you can make decisions in a calm and in a way where you have your wits about you, so to speak. So I'm taking those principles that I learned and now applying it to this new initiative that I'm launching, a company called have launched Zen Culture Solutions. And I simply wanted my objectives are twofold, Patrick. Simple as that. And that is, I believe in our next generation. I really do. And I believe that there's so much more advanced than we were. The ability to, the technology at their disposal. So I love working with our young people, and I just feel like they're so talented. And what I'm trying to do is bridge that gap with trying to get into the finance world. Well, guess what? As I said earlier, finance is an old institution. These institutions are very, long-standing, and they just exactly haven't changed their ways. So what I'd like to do, what I'm trying to do, is to speak to our leaders in our industry today to say, hey, we have some solutions to help you change the way that you look at leadership in a way where it's more conducive to our world today, especially with our next generation. And there's a lot that goes into that, and I have a specific program, and there's a company called Culture Plus that I'm working with. They wrote a book called Love as a Business Strategy. I know it sounds, interesting, like love on Wall Street, but let's face it, it's not what you think, and it can be tough love, right? But I think it would be a lot more beneficial to our employees that are not only coming into the industry, but that are there today. Now, the second item that I'm working on is those that are looking to get into our industry. I want to arm them with the realities of what's to come. Guys, you're facing a crap storm. Like it is an avalanche of just one challenge and obstacle after another. And if you don't have those tools, and I know Wall Street Oasis does a great job of trying to prep you for that with interviewing, with sort of the behavioral aspects of what you need. It is a lot more complex once you're actually in there. And I'm going out on speaking engagements at universities. I have another one next week to kind of inform our prospective entry, students right now that are looking to get into our industry, but also those that are even first year, second year, how to survive and then how to thrive. So not only how to gain entry into the industry, how to actually make it and survive, and sort of coach them through everything that they're going to face. And I sort of almost have a blueprint on how to do that, just because I've seen everything. I've been through, financial crisis. I've been through management changes and promotion processes and all these things that you're going to face, compensation discussions, networking, all these things that I think can benefit our next generation, but also the tools that perhaps maybe we're not focusing on enough. The self-awareness I talked about, knowing your temperament, knowing, are you a good fit for PE? Are you a good fit for IB? Are you a good fit? How can you be objective with yourself? So it's to have those discussions. And if you're not, well, yeah.
It sounds like you're doing the speaking engagements, but is the business Zen Culture Solutions, is it really more of like a B2B play where you're hoping that the investment banks will come in and hire you to help change their system and their culture? Or is it more of like, or is it also I should say not or, but is it also like going B2C where you're like, you know, taking on mentees and stuff like that? Or is it kind of both?
Yes, it's absolutely both. So
Okay.
I'm working with larger organizations. The aim is to help transform cultures in a way which Wall Street's never seen before, but it's necessary. We're armed with so much data. And actually, the company I'm working with was an ex-software company. Actually, they still have the software company, but we're implementing a lot of data analytics to illustrate to these companies and organizations. We're not limiting it just to the bulge brackets. We're going at all levels. So that's one aspect of what I'm doing on the leadership side. But I also want to, I'm comfortable in coaching and career coaching those that want to be are aspiring leaders, or those that are just struggling with their day to day, that they feel like they want to quit. And how do I deal with a bad manager and my toxic culture, and I'm having trouble with this colleague? We all face that, right? Faced with it for 20. I was faced with those instances for 20 plus years. So
We had a
I can
topic
help.
today on the weekly wrap-up pod that was all
Yeah.
about how do I deal with an associate that's throwing me under the bus, has no social skills.
Exactly. Oh my
Yeah.
God, there's so much of that. And there's so much of
Smart.
that. And you can just throw your hands in the air and be like, you know what, I quit. The easy thing to do. And I'm not going to lie, I did it a couple times.
Mhm.
But that sets you back career-wise, right?
Yeah.
So if you just keep in mind, guys, if you quit a job without having a job, it's going to set you back. So I'm here to help you and prevent you from doing that, and to guide you through those murky waters and the challenges that you're inevitably going to face or are facing. And I can give you a good roadmap as to how to handle that career-wise and decision-making wise.
I love it. I think we need a lot more of this. I hope that the banks are listening, and I hope they'll, hire you to come in and help with that. I mean, I'm curious, like, obviously you talk about the nice to haves. I'm curious like if you had your ideal investment bank, or you could do
Yeah.
whatever you wanted, the CEO said tomorrow, Houlihan or CEO from Houlihan comes in and says, yes, you can do whatever you want with this
Yep.
bank. Like, how are you going to change things? I'd be curious, like, what you'd go after first.
Love to answer that. Sure.
Yeah.
So luckily I have a great friend at Google in the Bay Area, and because I'm a student of leadership, I asked him, "Hey, can I spend some time on your campus?" And he invited me, and he managed a team, so I got to spend some time with his team, and I actually got in on a couple of meetings where they were talking about sort of development of products and those things, and I saw how they operated. And Wall Street is entrenched in hierarchy, right? And so, look, you need hierarchy to a degree, right? You earn your stripes, you're going to reach certain levels, you're going to earn titles. But what I learned at Google, and this is what I employed on my teams anyway, but Google sort of affirmed to me sort of the way that they conduct their business, and obviously they're successful they are. But they'd just as much rather hear an idea from a first-year employee than someone who'd been there 10 years, and that person had the same voice as the person who had been here 10, 15, years, and they were just as engaged, if not more. So, and they were given a platform. In our industry, sometimes you got to kind of earn your stripes, so to speak. And I'm of the belief that, look, even if you're a first year and you have a great idea and you have a voice, I want to hear you. If I'm an MD, I want to hear you, right? And I think what we need to do is focus a little less on the hierarchy. And I think an organization like BlackRock is phenomenal. The hierarchy, they sort of practice that in an industry where it's not normal, where hierarchy is sort of not as common. Yes, there are those titles, but there's less hierarchy in kind of how they, the MDs make themselves readily available. They walk the floor and they talk and to everyone. But that's kind of my ideal environment, where there's more of an emphasis on employee experience rather than the client experience. Yes, you're going to have to go after that big deal, and yes, you're going to have to go after that the M&As that are out there, and you're chasing all of that. But if you focus on the employee, they're going to inherently want to, because you're vested in them, they're going to vest in that process, in those clients, in their clients, more naturally, right? they're less apt to do so if you don't invest in them. And that's when you have to throw money at them and all those things. So what I'm saying is let's train and arm our leaders to be more equipped with how to focus more on the employee. And we don't have those tools. I can tell you for a fact, because I was very involved in JP Morgan's learning and development program, that there was less of an emphasis on those types of skills for our leaders. And I actually brought something to the attention of our CEO at the time, which was actually predicated on developing that foundation for leaders in call it what you will, emotional intelligence, self-awareness, mindfulness, all those things, but ultimately with a message that let's focus on our employees because they will take care of the client afterwards.
Yeah.
Right. And so my ideal place would be where we focus more on employee development, give them the more tools to learn better learning programs, better development programs. And because we've placed such an emphasis on the client and it's such a competitive industry, you have to, right? But you got to look at the macro. Don't look at let's look at the long game and be like, hey, if we can sustain a culture of where our employees are happy and our retention is higher with our employees, well, guess what? Clients are going to be that much happier because they know they have the same people they're working with for more than just a year or two.
Yeah, you'll have more third-year analysts and second-year analysts sticking around,
which is rare.
So they'll be better.
Which is rare, but guess what? That'll be your competitive advantage as an investment bank, right?
Yeah, no, it's
so
I think when you were speaking, I was thinking of like just the inherent structures of how things work, down from staffing all the way up through like how they staff a deal team of like has to be one analyst, one associate, one this, and like it's very rigid.
It doesn't have to be that way. It really doesn't. And I think the sooner we break down those barriers, I think it'll be an incredible transformation in terms of culture, but also ultimately productivity. Look, we only have one life to live. We can choose to come into work and be unhappy and make a lot of money. But we're going to go home unhappy. We're going to take it to our families. Do we want that? Do we really want that? And look at the mental health stats. We talked about that earlier. I mean, people are getting illnesses that they never had years ago, and this industry is not helping. It's more conducive to those types of illnesses when we're at our most fragile.
Yeah, we're releasing a investment banking working conditions survey. This is going to be our third year, I believe. And it was really bad year one. It was middle COVID. Last year it was still really bad. Slightly better though from COVID.
Yeah,
I'd be very
amazing, isn't it?
See where it comes out this year. I mean,
wait, Patrick, was that the data that I saw from Poets and Quants? It came from
probably
your
probably
survey.
came from our survey. Yeah.
Okay.
We surveyed, I think it was like 600 analysts, mostly analysts in the first and second years, and some associates as well. But we will. Yeah, I think we need to get going on that. We're trying to release it in March, but it's about this time every year. I'll be curious to see what it is, but super fascinating. My concern is like, I think the way banking works, because it's not a software business where you're building products that require like, it's almost like to get into Google as a software engineer, the expectation is like you're pretty brilliant on a technical side and all this stuff. For investment banking, like the requirements they're often screening for work ethic more than pure analytical ability or.
I understand that. And I was right in the middle of that screening.
Yeah.
But let's face it, the human elements take over.
Mm-hmm.
And work ethic and human elements. And look, I understand the competitive nature of investment banking, especially.
Yeah.
Right. And deal making and pressures that go into it and what's at stake. I get all that. But the human elements will never trump any of the gravity of all of those, what we deem as.
I just think, how do you put in the incentives for the MDs who are now in a sales role and getting maybe a percentage of whatever they close? How do you put them not to abuse the junior resources? That's the hard. That's
data. Data on attrition, data on what the cost is to your bottom line of the firm when there is that attrition. Employee engagement will increase. And I just read Forbes just had an article where if you focus more on the employee experience, your productivity is going to go up 4 times more than if you focus on client experience. So, we're all data driven, especially in finance.
100% agree. I just think that the incentives at the MD level, first off, they've been put through the ringer coming up. Number one. Number two, they're focused on their bottom line. It feels, even at a bank with a good brand, oftentimes it feels like they're these independent businesses all vying for the same resources.
Yeah.
And so like I think that dynamic, and maybe it comes down to compensation structure, how people are compensated. Maybe more of their compensation needs to be tied with the overall firm's performance. Then I know the CEOs of the banks are, yeah, that's great, but then your top performers are going to leave and go get paid by,
Exactly.
So I think that like you have a lot of very complex dynamics. I absolutely agree. Like if you can get the juniors, it's absolutely competitive advantage. I think the hard part is the incentives, getting the incentives right. In terms of the way the structures, in terms of the way it's a client services deal, so you're always going to be, they always want to be on call, and then there's no negative downside personally in the short run to them by using the junior resources.
Listen, you're right. Those are the realities.
Yeah.
And I think I'm not saying that what we're trying to do is first of all can happen overnight, but I think we need to talk about it more.
Absolutely.
And talk about
the CEO should really
yeah.
care about what you're saying. Really
Yes.
care about what you're saying. But then how do you get your MDs to fall in line, right? And so yeah, you do the training, but like how do you get them to really fall in line when there's, that's I think that's where where the rubber meets the road, and where I think there needs to be like that really.
I welcome the challenge, and I think look, I think there's always a solution to a problem. It's just that we're so accustomed to doing things the way we have for so long.
Yeah.
And like we're so entrenched in those beliefs. So if you're gonna believe that there's no way around it, then ultimately that's what you're gonna have. And you're going to go into that same never-ending cycle.
I mean, I think it's a no-brainer that it would be better for the firm overall.
Yeah, but I get you. Yeah,
I think it's at the hard part of the challenge. I think is not showing data, not even showing data that's true. I think the banks realize it's a problem. I think it's getting the people at the top to be incentivized properly so you don't lose them, but that they care enough not to do that. And maybe some of it's around EQ and talking about culture and mindfulness and all this stuff. I don't know. Like I think it's really hard. I've struggled thinking about this too, because it's like, what do we play? What's the role that Wall Street Oasis plays?
To be honest with you, yes, to be honest with you, those are valid questions, Patrick, and you're absolutely right. Now, when you talk about these concepts I brought up, a lot of them certainly don't play in certain areas of the bank, right? Yeah. Or less apt to be more effective because of what you just described.
Yeah.
But there are, banks are large, and there's different areas. Operations are cost centers, deemed cost centers, where they're deemed an expense. So guess what? Employees are treated that way, right? And so there are risk management and all these other technology even. I mean, there's so many areas where you can employ some of these strategies where human capital is not being used in its optimal way, and so you're ultimately going to bleed, through losing employees. You're going to bleed talent, and then spend that much more money trying to retain others, or trying to hire other talent. But I do think in the investment banking space, there's still things that we can do.
Yeah.
Perhaps looking at the compensation structures, but I do think there's elements of how we can work with the MDs. And actually, I'm working with one MD at a I can't name the firm, where we're talking about these things, because he's telling me I cannot connect with my junior, my analysts, and he's having a hard time working with them, and he's just basically throwing his hands up in the air and be like, I can't do it anymore. And he's just resigned to the fact that he's going to keep losing them, and he's less incentivized to have to invest. Because what I'm saying is spend more time with them, right? Yeah. And impart your wisdom and all that you've learned. And it's breaking out of those cycles and that thought process that I can't meet with them halfway.
Super interesting. Yeah. Super. Yeah. I struggle myself. I think it's great work you're doing. I think it's super necessary. And if I think it needs to be figured out. I mean, it's not even at the bulge bracket banks; it's at the middle markets. I see this like in even the Midwest, they can't find any talent. I know, at least especially during COVID, when there was a lot of deals coming through, we're getting calls for our recruiting service like, we want an experienced analyst. I'm like, yeah, you and everybody else. That's what I tell them.
But yeah, what does it tell you when these kids that you pen are like already plotting their exits? Like that should be a wake up call to these MDs to say, look, this is the perception that they have.
Yeah.
Right. So is that not incentive enough for you to try to do something about it? And we can be creative. These are smart people.
Yeah. Yeah. I love it.
So
I mean, I think you're doing great work. Keep it up.
No, listen, I love what you guys do. I love what you guys do and all the value add to our audience, and it's phenomenal work that you do. So it's just a privilege to be on with you. And if I can help anyone in the audience, look me up, Weiss at Chicks Out on LinkedIn. Zen Culture Solutions, whatever I can do to help anyone, I'm happy to.
Great. And we'll put in links to your company and then to your mentor profile through WSO as well. And
That's
then,
right. I'm a mentor as well. Obviously,
so if you want to connect with Weiss, please feel free to reach out. Weiss, any final last words of wisdom before we call it?
Well, just everyone, be true to yourself when you're making decisions. What is it that you love? What are your passions? You may not know right now. Exploring is not a bad thing. Finding, ultimately you're going to find your calling. And let's face it, it's not going to feel like a job if you love what you do. Otherwise, you're going to be breaking into a cycle never-ending cycle where you, for the next 10 to 15, 20 years of your life, you're going to go into work and be like, what did I actually achieve? Or am I really happy? So be conscious of your decision making, and know your true self when you make these decisions. Be fair to yourself, and don't do things for the reasons that your peers are doing things because they're getting ahead and they're making more money. And just a little be cautious when you make those types of decisions because of those reasons. Do what's best for you, and only you know yourself. So that would be those words of hopefully a little bit of wisdom.
I love it. I love it. Yeah, more introspection, please. We all need it.
Yes, a little more introspection. Exactly.
Thanks so much, Weiss. Appreciate your time.
Thank you, Patrick. I appreciate it.
And thanks to you, my listeners at Wall Street Oasis. If you have any suggestions whatsoever, please don't hesitate to send them my way, Patrick at wallstreetoasis.com. Until next time.